You're selfish, Mom. My son said it in the middle of Sunday dinner after I refused to give him another $5,000. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms and said, "If you really loved your grandchildren, you'd help." I sat there staring at the roast chicken I paid for while my granddaughter Sophie looked like she wanted to cry. 2 days earlier, I couldn't even afford my blood pressure medication. But Melissa had just posted photos from a luxury spa resort. That night, I quietly called my lawyer and changed everything in my will. What my son discovered a week later left him completely speechless. You're selfish, Mom. My son said those words while passing the mashed potatoes across the dinner table as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. For a second, nobody moved. The fork stopped clinking against plates. Even the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker suddenly felt too loud. I looked down at the roast chicken sitting in the middle of the table, the same recipe Daniel used to beg me to make every Sunday when he was a boy. Back then, he used to wrap his little arms around my waist while I cooked and tell me I made the best dinners in the world. Now he couldn't even look at me without resentment in his eyes. Melissa sat beside him in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and the expression on her face told me this conversation had been rehearsed before I ever walked through their front door. Sophie sat quietly at the far end of the table, pushing peas around her plate without eating them. She was 17 now, old enough to understand when adults were lying, old enough to recognize cruelty when it sat right in front of her. I'm selfish, I asked softly. My voice barely sounded like my own. Daniel let out a bitter laugh and leaned back in his chair. Yeah, Mom. Selfish. You know Melissa and I are struggling right now, and you suddenly decide to cut us off financially like none of this affects your family. I noticed the word family immediately. Not you love us. Not we need help. Family. People always used that word when they wanted something from you. I reached for my water glass slowly because my hands had started trembling again. The medication I was supposed to take every morning was running low, but I'd been stretching the pills longer than prescribed to save money. 3 days earlier, I stood at the pharmacy counter staring at a total I couldn't comfortably afford anymore. $83.40. I still remembered the embarrassed smile I gave the pharmacist while asking if there was a cheaper generic version available. Yet earlier that same afternoon, Melissa had posted photos online from some luxury spa resort outside Scottsdale. White robes, champagne glasses, heated pools glowing blue beneath string lights. Much needed self-care weekend, her caption said. I stared at those photos for almost 10 minutes before quietly locking my phone and making myself a cup of instant coffee for dinner because groceries had become expensive lately. Nobody cut you off, I finally said. I just told you I can't keep giving you money every few months anymore. Melissa sighed dramatically before speaking for the first time that evening. It's not every few months, Evelyn. We've had emergencies. Emergencies. I almost smiled at that word too. Over the last 6 years, emergencies had apparently included a Disney vacation, a kitchen remodel, a leased SUV Daniel absolutely didn't need, private gymnastics lessons Sophie quit after 3 months, and Melissa's online boutique business that quietly disappeared after burning through nearly $12,000 of my savings. I knew every number because I was the one who wrote the checks. Dad would have helped us, Daniel muttered. That one landed exactly where he intended it to. My late husband Richard had been gone for almost 4 years, but somehow Daniel still knew how to use his father's memory like a weapon. Richard had always been softer with him than I was. Softer with everyone, honestly. He used to say yes first and worry later. But near the end of his life, after Daniel asked us for another large loan to cover temporary financial problems, I remember Richard sitting quietly in our garage one night with a cup of black coffee in his hands. One day, he told me, they'll stop seeing us as parents and start seeing us as a safety net. I hated hearing that back then. I thought he was becoming cynical. Now I realized he was simply seeing things clearly before I did. Dad also worked until he was 72, I replied calmly. And he never expected someone else to fund his life. Daniel's face tightened immediately. Melissa jumped in before he could answer. Wow, she said quietly. That's unbelievable. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. Perfect blonde waves. French manicure. Diamond earrings Daniel definitely couldn't afford on his salary alone. What's unbelievable? I asked. She leaned forward slightly. That you'd sit there protecting your savings while your own son is drowning. Across the table, Sophie finally looked up. Her eyes shifted nervously between all of us. She knew this wasn't about savings. It wasn't even about money anymore. It was about expectation. Somewhere along the way, helping my son stopped being appreciated and became required. Daniel rubbed his forehead dramatically. You know what the worst part is? You act like we're using you. I didn't answer immediately because the truth sat too heavily in my chest to come out politely. Instead, I glanced around the dining room. The hardwood floors. The oversized pendant lights. The expensive open-concept renovation Melissa proudly showed off online every holiday season. I helped pay for most of it. Not because they forced me. Because I loved my son. Because after Richard died, helping Daniel made me feel needed. Useful. Less alone. Grief does strange things to older women. Sometimes we confuse being needed with being loved. I don't think you're using me, I said carefully. I think you've gotten comfortable depending on me. Daniel pushed his chair back suddenly, the sound scraping harshly across the hardwood floor. See? That's exactly what I mean. You always make us feel guilty. Daniel, Sophie whispered nervously. Don't. He ignored her completely. Do you know how humiliating it is having to ask your own mother for help all the time? I stared at him in silence for several seconds before finally speaking. Then stop asking. The room went completely still after that. Even Melissa looked shocked for a moment. Because mothers like me weren't supposed to say things like that. We were supposed to keep giving until there was nothing left. Keep sacrificing. Keep understanding. Keep shrinking ourselves to protect everyone else's comfort. Daniel shook his head slowly like he couldn't recognize me anymore. You've changed, he said coldly. Maybe I had. Or maybe I was finally becoming the version of myself Richard tried to warn me I needed to become before it was too late. Melissa stood up abruptly and started gathering plates even though dinner wasn't finished. I think we're done here, she muttered. Sophie remained frozen in her chair, staring down at her untouched food. I noticed tears collecting in her eyes, though she tried hard to hide them. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to tell her none of this was her fault. But at that moment, I suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. I reached for my purse quietly and stood up from the table. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody apologized. Daniel didn't even look at me as I slipped on my coat near the front door. The porch light flickered softly against the cold November air outside. As I walked toward my old sedan parked along the curb, I heard the front door open behind me. For one foolish second, I thought maybe Daniel had come after me. Maybe my son remembered who I was beyond the checks and wire transfers and emergency loans. But it was Sophie. She wrapped her sweater tighter around herself before hurrying down the porch steps. Grandma, she called softly. I turned around. Her face looked pale beneath the porch light. Nervous. I'm sorry, she whispered. You shouldn't be, I told her gently. She hesitated before lowering her voice even more. They were already upset before you got here tonight. Dad found out the bank denied them again this morning. Something cold settled deep in my stomach. Denied them for what? Sophie swallowed hard. Another mortgage refinance. I stared at her without speaking. Then she added the sentence that changed everything. Mom said if you wouldn't help this time, they might lose the house. The drive home felt longer than usual that night. The streets were nearly empty except for the occasional glow of headlights passing through the dark intersections. Christmas decorations had already started appearing around the neighborhood even though Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away. Wreaths hung on front doors. White lights wrapped around porch railings. Everything looked warm and cheerful from the outside. But inside my chest, something heavy had settled there and refused to move. I kept hearing Sophie's voice in my mind. They might lose the house. Not because of some medical emergency. Not because Daniel had lost his job. Because they had spent years living far beyond what they could actually afford while assuming I would always be there to catch them when things fell apart. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the temperature had dropped into the low 40s. I sat in the car for several minutes with the engine running, staring at the dark windows of my little house. Richard and I bought that house 36 years ago when Daniel was only 6. Back then it seemed enormous to us. 3 bedrooms, a tiny backyard, a cracked concrete driveway Richard promised he would repair every summer but never did. We spent years making payments on that house. Years sacrificing vacations, new furniture, dinners out, also Daniel could grow up somewhere stable, somewhere safe. I remember Richard working overtime shifts at the manufacturing plant while I cleaned offices at night after finishing my regular bookkeeping job during the day. There were winters when our checking account dropped so low I avoided looking at the balance altogether. But we never borrowed money we could not repay. We never expected other people to rescue us from our own choices. I finally stepped out of the car and wrapped my coat tighter around myself as cold wind swept leaves across the driveway. The porch light flickered on automatically the moment I reached the front steps. Richard installed that motion sensor himself about 10 years ago after I slipped carrying groceries one icy December evening. He spent the rest of the night apologizing even though none of it had been his fault. I should have fixed that light sooner, he kept saying while pressing an ice pack gently against my ankle. Little things like that stay with you after someone dies. Not the grand gestures. The ordinary moments. The way he warmed my side of the bed with his feet during winter. The way he always filled my gas tank before snowstorms because he worried I might get stranded somewhere. Grief changes shape as you get older. It stops feeling sharp all the time. Instead, it becomes quiet. Like a second shadow following you through every room. Inside the house, I kicked off my shoes and placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter. The silence wrapped around me immediately. No television noise. No footsteps upstairs. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. I used to hate this silence after Richard passed away. It made the house feel abandoned. Now, some nights, it felt peaceful compared to family dinners at Daniel's house. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the leftovers sitting inside. Half a carton of soup. Eggs. A few slices of turkey breast. Grocery prices had become ridiculous lately, and even though I tried not to complain about it, every trip to the store seemed more stressful than the last. I found myself checking prices constantly now, deciding which things I could live without. Fresh berries had become a luxury. So had good coffee. Last month I stopped buying the salmon I liked because it cost nearly $20 for 2 fillets. $20 used to mean almost nothing to me. Funny how quickly money changes meaning once people start draining it from you little by little over the years. I poured myself a glass of water and noticed my medication bottle sitting near the sink. Only 4 pills left. My doctor wanted me taking them daily, but lately I had started spacing them out every other day instead. I told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize eventually. But standing there in my dim kitchen, I suddenly realized something painful. I had spent so much time protecting Daniel from financial consequences that I quietly accepted consequences for myself instead. My chest tightened at the thought. Not anger exactly. More like disappointment. Deep, exhausting disappointment. I carried my water into the living room and lowered myself carefully onto the couch beneath the old family photographs hanging on the wall. There was Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball trophy almost bigger than his torso. Daniel at 16 smiling awkwardly before prom. Daniel on his wedding day standing beside Melissa in front of the church. I remembered how proud I felt that day. Melissa looked beautiful in her satin gown, and Daniel could not stop smiling at her during the ceremony. Richard leaned over halfway through the reception and whispered, "Well, there goes our little boy." I laughed so hard champagne nearly came out of my nose. Back then, I thought Melissa was polished. Ambitious. Organized. She worked in real estate and always carried herself with confidence. Richard was never completely comfortable around her, though. She likes expensive things a little too much, he told me once after they got engaged. I defended her immediately. She is young, I said. Young people spend differently now. But over the years I noticed things. The constant upgrades. New furniture every season. Designer handbags. Luxury skincare products lining the bathroom counters like little trophies. Every holiday had to look picture perfect online. Matching pajamas for Christmas photos. Catered birthday parties for Sophie. Elaborate vacations they could not realistically afford. And every time money became tight afterward, Daniel called me sounding embarrassed and stressed. At least in the beginning, he sounded embarrassed. Eventually, even that disappeared. The requests became routine. Predictable. Almost transactional. My phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, pulling me from my thoughts. For one foolish second, I hoped it might be Daniel apologizing. Instead, it was a text from Melissa. I hope you realize how much pressure Daniel is under right now. No apology. No acknowledgement of what happened at dinner. Just blame wrapped inside concern. I stared at the message for a long moment before locking my phone without answering. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 7 years ago, shortly after Richard retired, Daniel asked us for $20,000 to help with a down payment on their current house. I remember sitting at this exact same spot on the couch while Richard reviewed their financial paperwork. Mortgage estimates. Credit card debt. Car payments. Richard frowned the entire time. This house is too expensive for them, he told me after Daniel left that night. They're stretching themselves too thin. I argued with him for almost an hour. We are his parents, I insisted. If we can help him build a better life, why would we not? Richard eventually agreed because he loved Daniel as much as I did. But before writing the check, he made me promise something. Evelyn, he said quietly, helping someone once is kindness. Helping them forever becomes permission. At the time, I thought he sounded harsh. Sitting alone in my living room now, I realized he had been trying to protect me long before I understood I needed protecting. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows. I glanced toward the hallway leading to our bedroom and suddenly felt too tired to keep sitting upright. But before going to bed, I walked to the small desk near the staircase and opened the drawer where Richard kept important papers. Insurance documents. Old tax returns. Retirement statements. Beneath them sat the business card of the attorney who handled Richard's estate after his death. I stared at that card for several seconds before picking it up slowly. Then I placed it beside my phone on the coffee table where I could see it clearly. Because for the first time in years, a quiet thought entered my mind that refused to leave. Maybe saying no at dinner had not started the real problem. Maybe it had finally revealed it. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did now. Aging changes your sleep patterns in strange ways. You spend your younger years desperate for rest, then one day your body starts waking you before dawn whether you want it to or not. The house was cold when I stepped into the kitchen wearing my robe and thick wool socks. November mornings in Ohio carried a damp chill that settled into old bones quickly. I filled the kettle with water and stood quietly by the sink while coffee brewed, staring out at the backyard Richard used to take care of so carefully. Most of the flower beds had already gone bare for winter. A few stubborn yellow mums still clung to life near the fence line. Richard planted those 3 years ago because he said the yard looked too sad in late autumn without a little color somewhere. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and tried not to think about the dinner from the night before. But memories have a way of replaying themselves louder in silence. Especially painful ones. I kept hearing Daniel's voice. Not angry exactly. Worse than angry. Entitled. As though my refusal had somehow betrayed him instead of simply disappointing him. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Around 8:30, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For one hopeful second, I thought maybe my son had slept on things and realized how cruel he sounded. Instead, it was a notification from social media. Melissa had posted another photo. I do not know why I still looked at her posts anymore. Maybe because part of me kept hoping I would find evidence that I had misunderstood her all these years. But the woman smiling from my phone screen looked perfectly content standing inside some upscale furniture showroom with glossy white cabinets behind her. The caption read, "Dream Kitchen Loading." I stared at the picture in disbelief. They were shopping for renovations while begging me for money to save their home. My stomach tightened immediately. That was when something unpleasant began connecting itself in my mind. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like puzzle pieces finally fitting together after years of confusion. I thought about all the little comments Melissa made over time. This neighborhood would be perfect if homes were just slightly bigger. Sophie deserves her own bathroom now that she is older. Property values are exploding around here. Every conversation somehow circled back to wanting more. A larger house. Better schools. Luxury vacations. Upgraded appliances. Nothing was ever enough for very long. And somehow, every time reality caught up with them. Financially, Daniel came to me looking exhausted and ashamed while Melissa stayed carefully in the background pretending she hated asking for help. I took another sip of coffee and remembered Christmas 2 years earlier. Daniel arrived carrying expensive gifts for everyone. New electronics for Sophie. Designer perfume for Melissa. A smartwatch for himself. Richard had been gone less than a year at that point, and I was still learning how to survive the holidays without him. After dinner that night, Daniel pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else watched a movie in the living room. "Mom," he said quietly, "I hate to ask, but things are a little tight after the holidays." I gave him $3,000 before New Year's Day because I did not want my son starting the year stressed and struggling. 2 months later, Melissa posted photos from a ski resort in Colorado. At the time, I convinced myself maybe the trip had already been paid for earlier. Maybe there was some explanation. Mothers become experts at explaining away things that hurt them. Around 10 o'clock, I drove to the grocery store because I needed milk and bread. The parking lot was crowded with retirees and young mothers pushing shopping carts through the cold wind. Inside, holiday decorations already hung from the ceiling. Artificial pine garlands. Red bows. Plastic snowflakes. Everything smelled faintly like cinnamon from the bakery section. I moved slowly through the aisles comparing prices the way I always did now. Generic cereal instead of brand name. Frozen vegetables instead of fresh. Ground turkey instead of beef because it was cheaper by almost $4 a pound. A younger version of me would have found this depressing. But lately it mostly made me angry. Not because of the budgeting itself. Richard and I budgeted our entire lives. The anger came from realizing how much easier things would have been if I had stopped financing Daniel's lifestyle years ago. At checkout, the total came to $72.16. I watched the cashier ring up each item while mentally calculating how long everything would last. 2 weeks if I stretched meals carefully. Maybe 3. As I slid my debit card into the machine, I suddenly remembered another conversation with Richard from years earlier. Daniel had asked us to co-sign a loan after some failed investment opportunity with one of Melissa's cousins. Richard refused immediately. It was one of the only times I ever saw Daniel genuinely angry with his father. "You can help, but you choose not to," he snapped before storming out of our house. I remember crying afterward because I hated conflict between them. But Richard stayed calm the entire time. "Helping someone avoid consequences forever does not save them," he told me quietly after Daniel left. "It just delays the damage until it becomes bigger." Standing there in the grocery store years later, I realized Richard had understood something about our son long before I ever could. Daniel was not drowning because life had been unfair to him. He was drowning because every time consequences approached, someone else pulled him back to shore. Usually me. Outside, snow flurries had started falling lightly by the time I loaded groceries into the trunk. Tiny white specks drifted across the gray sky while cold wind stung my cheeks. Winter always made me feel reflective. Maybe because everything slows down during winter. The world grows quieter. Lonelier. On the drive home, my phone rang through the car speakers. Melissa. I almost ignored it. Almost. But curiosity got the better of me. "Hello," I answered carefully. Her tone sounded unusually sweet immediately. That alone made me suspicious. "Evelyn, I think things got emotional last night." Emotional. Such a polite word for humiliation. "Did they?" I asked calmly. She paused for half a second before continuing. "Daniel is just overwhelmed. The mortgage situation has been very stressful." There it was. Straight to business. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Sophie mentioned refinancing. Melissa sighed dramatically. "The bank is being difficult right now. We just need a little temporary help getting through this rough patch." Temporary. I nearly laughed hearing that word again. Every rough patch over the last decade somehow became my responsibility eventually. How much? I asked quietly. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Melissa lowered her voice slightly as if saying the number softer would somehow make it less outrageous. 30,000. My foot eased off the gas pedal without me realizing it. $30,000? It would catch up the mortgage and clear some high-interest debt. Then we could finally breathe again. Finally breathe again. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something practiced in front of a mirror beforehand. I stared at the road ahead while cold realization settled deeper into my chest. This was never about emergencies anymore. They had built an entire life around the assumption that I would always save them before things collapsed completely. I cannot do that, I said softly. Melissa's sweetness vanished immediately. You have the money. Not, can you? Not, would you consider it? Just certainty. Ownership. Like my savings already belong to them. I felt something inside me go very still then. Not sadness this time. Clarity. Pure and uncomfortable clarity. No, I replied calmly. I have what is left of my retirement. Melissa exhaled sharply. So you're really willing to watch your own son lose everything? I pulled into my driveway slowly while snow continued falling against the windshield. Then I said the sentence that surprised even me. No, Melissa. I think I am finally watching my son face the life he chose. After my conversation with Melissa, I sat alone in my car for several minutes without turning off the engine. Snowflakes drifted slowly across the windshield beneath the yellow glow of the porch light, and for the first time in years, I stopped feeling guilty for saying no. That surprised me more than anything. Mothers like me are trained to carry guilt the way other people carry house keys. We feel guilty for resting. Guilty for spending money on ourselves. Guilty for disappointing our children even when they are fully grown adults with families of their own. But sitting there in the cold silence that evening, another feeling had finally started pushing through all the guilt. Anger. Quiet anger. The kind that builds slowly over years until one day it becomes impossible to ignore anymore. I turned off the car and carried my groceries inside while snow collected lightly along the porch railing. The house smelled faintly like coffee and old cedar wood, the same comforting scent it had carried for decades. Richard always loved this house during winter. Every December he insisted on buying a real Christmas tree even after Daniel moved out. Artificial trees do not smell like memories, he used to say while dragging pine needles across the living room carpet. I smiled faintly at the thought before setting grocery bags onto the counter. Then my eyes landed on the stack of unpaid envelopes near the toaster. Electric bill. Property taxes. Prescription refill notice. Nothing catastrophic. Just ordinary expenses. Real-life expenses. The kind Daniel and Melissa never seemed to think I had. I opened the refrigerator and carefully placed groceries onto the shelves one item at a time. Milk in the back. Soup containers stacked neatly. Eggs along the side compartment. Everything organized because organized things lasted longer. At least that is what Richard always believed. Halfway through unpacking, I noticed the small ceramic cookie jar sitting above the microwave. Sophie painted it for me when she was 9 years old. The lid sat crooked because she made it uneven in art class, and one side carried a faded purple handprint pressed into the clay before firing. For Grandma's secret cookies, she told me proudly the Christmas she gave it to me. I reached up and touched the chipped edge gently. Out of everyone in that family, Sophie was the only one who still looked at me like a person instead of a resource. That realization hurt more deeply than I expected. My phone buzzed again around 7 that evening. Daniel this time. I stared at his name glowing on the screen before finally answering. Hello. Silence lingered for a second before he spoke. Mom. His voice sounded calmer than it had at dinner, but there was tension underneath every word. Melissa told me you refused to help us. Refused. As though I had denied food to starving children instead of declining a $30,000 bailout. I told her I cannot afford to keep financing your problems, I answered quietly. Daniel let out a frustrated sigh immediately. You make it sound like we are irresponsible. I closed my eyes for a moment because I was suddenly too tired for another performance. Are you saying you are not? Another silence followed. Longer this time. Then came the defensive tone I knew so well. Things got harder after inflation hit. The mortgage adjusted. Sophie's school expenses increased. You do not understand what it costs to raise a family anymore. I almost laughed hearing that. Richard and I raised Daniel during years when mortgage rates climbed above 13%. We survived layoffs, medical bills, recessions. We stretched one paycheck across impossible months while still making sure Daniel had school supplies and birthday presents under the tree every December morning. But somehow my son talked to me now as though hardship had only been invented for his generation. I understand responsibility, I said calmly. That is different. Daniel's voice hardened immediately. You know what Melissa thinks? Here we go, I thought. Melissa always entered the conversation eventually. She thinks you resent seeing us have a better life than you did. I stared at the dark kitchen window above the sink, watching snow continue falling softly outside. Better life. The phrase echoed strangely in my chest. Because the truth was, I had wanted that for him. Every overtime shift Richard worked. Every vacation we skipped. Every sacrifice we made was supposed to give Daniel opportunities we never had ourselves. That is what parents do. We struggle so our children might struggle less. But somewhere along the way, less struggle turned into endless entitlement. I never resented your success, I replied softly. I resent being treated like your emergency fund every time reality catches up with your spending. Daniel actually sounded offended by that. That is unbelievable. After everything we have done for you. I pulled the refrigerator door open again just to avoid saying something sharp immediately. What exactly have you done for me, Daniel? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Silence filled the line instantly. Not angry silence. Empty. Silence. Because for the first time, neither of us could pretend anymore. Richard used to mow the lawn here until arthritis made his knees too stiff. After he passed away, I hired a neighborhood teenager to do it because Daniel always seemed too busy. When my water heater broke last winter, I sat in this house without hot water for 6 days waiting for the repair appointment because I did not want to bother anyone. Last spring I carried heavy mulch bags across the backyard by myself until my lower back hurt for nearly a week afterward. Daniel visited on holidays. Sometimes birthdays. Usually if Melissa did not already have other plans. The idea that they had somehow sacrificed for me felt almost absurd. Mom, Daniel said finally, lowering his voice, we are family. There was that word again. Family. Always arriving right before requests for money. I leaned against the counter and remembered another conversation from years ago. Shortly after Richard died, Daniel sat beside me at this same kitchen table while I cried quietly over medical bills and funeral paperwork. He held my hand and said, "You will never go through life alone, Mom. I promise." At the time, those words meant everything to me. I truly believed my son loved me beyond obligation, beyond money, beyond convenience. Looking back now, I realized something painful. That promise started disappearing the moment my financial help slowed down. Family should not feel transactional, I said quietly. Daniel became defensive again immediately. So now helping your own son is transactional? No, I answered. Expecting endless help without accountability is. He exhaled sharply into the phone. You know what? Forget it. There was bitterness in his voice now. Coldness. Melissa was right. Ever since Dad died, you have changed. That one landed hard because part of me feared it might actually be true. Grief had changed me. Loneliness changed people too. Losing the person who's spent 40 years loving you honestly leaves a permanent crack somewhere inside your understanding of the world. But another thought followed quickly behind it. Maybe I had not become colder after Richard died. Maybe I had simply become easier to manipulate because I was afraid of losing the only family I had left. Maybe I finally stopped confusing love with financial support, I said softly. Daniel did not answer. A few seconds later, the line disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly and stood motionless in the kitchen while snow tapped gently against the windows. The silence afterward felt strangely peaceful. Painful, but peaceful. Then my eyes drifted toward the business card sitting on the coffee table near the living room. Richard's estate attorney. The same one who once told me after Richard's funeral, your husband worried more about your future than his own health near the end. At the time, I thought that was simply love speaking. Now I wondered if Richard saw this entire situation coming years before I did. I walked into the living room slowly and picked up the card between my fingers. The paper felt smooth and cold against my skin. Then I carried it back into the kitchen, sat down at the table where I once served birthday cakes and Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas breakfasts for my family, and for the first time in my life, I seriously considered protecting myself before protecting my son. 3 days passed without hearing from Daniel after our last phone call. That alone told me more than words ever could. When people love you, silence usually means concern. When people need something from you, silence becomes punishment. The first morning without his texts felt strange. The second felt heavier. By the third day, I realized something unsettling. My own son was waiting for me to break first. Waiting for guilt to pull me back into my old role so everything could continue exactly the way it always had. I woke up early Thursday morning to the sound of freezing rain tapping softly against the bedroom windows. The weather forecast warned about sleet all afternoon, so I pulled on my heavy winter coat and drove carefully to my doctor's appointment across town. The roads were slick and gray beneath the cloudy sky, and traffic moved slowly through the intersections. At 68 years old, even simple errands required more planning during winter. You think about icy sidewalks. You think about prescription costs. You think about whether your knees will ache worse tomorrow because of the cold, damp air settling into your joints. Aging is not dramatic the way younger people imagine it. It is quieter than that. It happens in small adjustments. Smaller grocery bags because your wrists hurt carrying too much weight. Turning the television louder than before. Sitting down while folding laundry because standing too long makes your lower back stiff. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room flipping through outdated magazines while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Across from me, an older man coughed into a handkerchief while his wife filled out paperwork beside him. Near the reception desk, a little girl played with a toy dinosaur while her mother scrolled through her phone looking exhausted. Ordinary life surrounded me. Ordinary people carrying invisible burdens no one else could fully see. Mrs. Harper, the nurse finally called. I followed her down the hallway slowly, stepping onto the scale before she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm. Her expression changed slightly while reading the numbers. "It is a little high today," she said gently. I smiled politely because I already knew why. Stress settles into the body eventually. It lives in your shoulders, your stomach, your heartbeat. Sometimes I think older women carry decades of stress quietly until one day their bodies simply stop pretending everything is fine. After the appointment, I stopped by the pharmacy to refill my medication. The pharmacist recognized me immediately. "Insurance still has not approved the cheaper version yet," he explained apologetically while ringing up the prescription. I nodded and handed over my debit card anyway. $112. I tried not to visibly react while entering my PIN number. As the receipt printed, I suddenly remembered buying Daniel his first winter coat when he was 6 years old. A thick navy blue jacket with bright red lining because he loved baseball colors back then. Richard and I could barely afford it that year, but we bought it anyway because parents find ways to make sacrifices feel normal. I remembered Daniel hugging me in the department store parking lot afterward because he was so excited to wear it to school. Back then, gratitude came naturally to him. Somewhere over the years, gratitude slowly transformed into expectation. Outside the pharmacy, freezing rain continued falling steadily across the parking lot. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and hurried carefully toward my car. Halfway there, my phone buzzed inside my purse. "Sophie." I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded nervous. "Grandma, are you busy?" "No, honey." A pause. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "Mom and Dad have been fighting a lot." My stomach tightened instantly. "About the house?" "About money." Another pause followed before she spoke again. "Dad is angry because the mortgage company keeps calling." I leaned against my car door while icy rain tapped softly across the pavement around me. "Sophie," I asked carefully, "how bad is it?" She hesitated long enough that I already knew the answer would hurt. "They're behind more than 6 months now." 6 months. My breath caught slightly in my chest. Melissa made it sound temporary. A rough patch. But 6 missed mortgage payments were not temporary problems. That was collapse. Grandma, Sophie whispered, I think they thought you would pay it. The honesty in her voice cut deeper than cruelty ever could. Because children say painful truths without dressing them up first. I closed my eyes briefly and suddenly another memory surfaced with perfect clarity. 2 summers ago, Daniel invited me over for a backyard barbecue. Melissa spent the entire afternoon showing guests around their remodeled kitchen while talking proudly about marble countertops imported from Italy. At one point she laughed and said, "You only live once, right?" Everyone laughed politely with her. I remember glancing at Richard's old wristwatch on my arm and thinking how many overtime shifts that countertop probably cost. Yet somehow they still needed help with groceries 2 months later. I slid into the driver's seat slowly and turned on the heater while Sophie continued talking quietly through the phone. Mom keeps saying everything will work out once you calm down. Calm down. As though refusing to finance someone else's debt was emotional instability instead of basic self-preservation. And what do you think? I asked softly. Sophie was quiet for several seconds. Then she answered in a voice barely above a whisper. I think they got too comfortable. I stared through the rain-streaked windshield, feeling something inside me crack open completely then. Not heartbreak this time. Recognition. The terrible kind that arrives too late. Because Sophie was right. Daniel and Melissa had built their entire adult lives around the assumption that someone else would absorb the consequences eventually. Bigger vacations than they could afford. Bigger house payments. Bigger credit card balances. Bigger appearances. And every time reality approached, I stepped in quietly before things became uncomfortable for them. Not because they manipulated me directly in the beginning. Because I loved my son more than I loved my own peace. Grandma? Sophie asked gently. Are you still there? Yes, sweetheart. I do not think Grandpa would have wanted this. Neither did I. But hearing it from her made my chest ache all over again. Richard always worried Daniel confused support with entitlement. I defended our son every single time. Even after Richard died, I kept defending him to myself. He is grieving. He is stressed. The economy is difficult. Raising a teenager is expensive. Excuses became easier than admitting the truth. The truth was uglier. Daniel stopped treating my help like generosity years ago. He started treating it like access. Listen to me carefully, I said softly to Sophie. None of this is your responsibility. I know. But she sounded tired in a way 17-year-olds should never sound. Dad keeps saying if you really loved us, you would help. There it was again. Love tied directly to money. Conditional affection disguised as family loyalty. I felt suddenly exhausted all the way down to my bones. I do love you, I told her quietly. Very much. I know you do. Her voice cracked slightly then. That is why this feels so awful. After we hung up, I sat alone in the parking lot with the car heater, humming softly while freezing rain blurred the world outside my windshield. For years, I believed helping Daniel made me a good mother. But good intentions do not always create good outcomes. Sometimes they create dependency. Sometimes they create resentment. Sometimes they teach people that your sacrifice exists for their convenience. I looked down at the pharmacy receipt sitting folded beside my purse. $112 for medication I genuinely needed. Meanwhile, my son expected $30,000 to rescue a lifestyle he refused to scale back himself. That was the moment I finally understood something painful but necessary. Daniel did not need saving anymore. He needed consequences. And for the first time in my life, I was seriously considering allowing him to face them. The following Monday morning, I called Richard's attorney for the first time in almost 3 years. Even dialing the number felt strangely emotional. The receptionist transferred me almost immediately, and when Howard Bennett's calm voice came through the phone, I suddenly felt nervous in a way I had not expected. Evelyn, he said warmly, it has been a long time. I stared out the kitchen window while snow melted slowly across the backyard fence. Yes, I answered softly. I think I finally need some advice. He offered me an appointment that afternoon. By 1 o'clock, I was driving downtown beneath a sky the color of steel wool. The city looked cold and tired in late November. Bare trees lined the sidewalks while people hurried along wearing heavy coats and carrying paper coffee cups through the wind. Howard's office sat inside an older brick building near the courthouse, the same place Richard and I visited years earlier when we finalized our estate planning. Walking through those doors without my husband beside me felt strange, like entering a life I no longer belonged to completely. The receptionist smiled kindly and offered me tea while I waited. Everything inside the office looked exactly the same as I remembered. Dark wood furniture, framed law degrees, the faint smell of leather and coffee lingering in the air. Richard used to joke that Howard's office smelled like expensive paperwork. Back then, estate planning conversations felt distant and unnecessary. We were healthy, busy, focused on building a future that suddenly arrived much faster than expected. Howard greeted me personally a few minutes later and guided me into his office. His hair had gone almost entirely silver now, but his voice still carried the same steady calmness Richard trusted completely. "How have you been holding up?" he asked gently after we sat down. Such a simple question. Yet, suddenly I realized nobody had asked me that honestly in a very long time. Not Daniel. Not Melissa. Most conversations lately revolved around what I could provide instead of how I was surviving. "I have been better," I admitted quietly. Howard nodded slowly like he already suspected as much. Then he folded his hands on the desk and waited patiently while I explained everything. The loans. The mortgage trouble. The dinner confrontation. Melissa asking for $30,000 as casually as if she were borrowing sugar from a neighbor. I expected to feel embarrassed speaking the truth aloud, but instead I felt something closer to relief. Because once painful things leave your chest and become actual words in the air, they stop controlling you quite as much. Howard listened without interrupting. Only once did his expression visibly change. 6 missed mortgage payments, he repeated carefully. That is significant. I nodded. Apparently they thought I would handle it. Howard leaned back in his chair slowly. Evelyn, may I ask you something difficult? Of course. If your retirement savings disappeared tomorrow, what would happen to you financially? The question landed harder than I expected. Because for years I only asked myself what would happen to Daniel without my help. Never what would happen to me if I kept giving it. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap. Age spots dotted my skin now. My wedding ring still sat on my finger even after all this time. Honestly? I answered softly. I do not know. Howard gave a small nod. That concerns me. Silence settled briefly across the office. Outside the window, snow drifted softly between downtown buildings, while traffic crawled below. Finally, Howard opened a folder on his desk. Richard worried about this before he passed. I looked up immediately. What do you mean? Howard adjusted his glasses carefully. About a year before his death, he updated portions of your estate documents. Mostly precautionary changes. My chest tightened slightly hearing that. Precautionary against what? Howard hesitated just long enough to make my stomach sink. Against the possibility that Daniel might eventually pressure you financially after Richard was gone. For several seconds, I could not speak at all. Because hearing someone else confirm what I had slowly started realizing myself felt devastating in a completely different way. Richard knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. He never told me, I whispered. Howard's expression softened. He did not want to upset you. But he loved you very much, Evelyn. He worried your kindness might leave you vulnerable someday. Vulnerable. Such a polite word for slowly being drained dry by the people you sacrificed your life for. Howard reached into the folder and slid several documents across the desk toward me. Your current estate plan leaves nearly everything equally to Daniel after your passing. I nodded slowly. That had always seemed natural. Obvious even. But there are other options if you are concerned about protecting your financial stability now. I stared down at the paperwork without fully reading it. Words blurred together slightly beneath my tired eyes. Trust structures. Asset protection. Healthcare directives. Legal language designed to prepare people for uncomfortable truths before those truths arrived unexpectedly. Can I ask you something? I said quietly. Howard nodded. Do you think I am overreacting? He did not answer immediately. Instead, He removed his glasses slowly and folded them on the desk. Evelyn, financial dependency changes family dynamics in ways people rarely notice until it becomes dangerous. Especially when boundaries disappear. I swallowed hard. Dangerous. Not physically, he clarified gently. Emotionally. Financially. Psychologically. Once someone begins viewing another person's savings as part of their own long-term security, resentment often develops when access is threatened. Access. There was that word again. Not love. Not support. Access. I suddenly remembered Melissa saying, "You have the money," during our phone conversation. Not asking. Assuming. Like my retirement account already belonged partly to them. Howard continued speaking softly. "You are 68 years old. You have medical expenses, property taxes, inflation, and unpredictable future healthcare costs. Your primary responsibility now is ensuring your own stability." I looked out the window again while snow continued falling across the city in soft white sheets. Richard spent decades trying to build stability for us. And after he died, I spent years slowly handing pieces of that stability away because saying no felt cruel. But maybe there was another kind of cruelty too. The kind people commit against themselves while trying too hard to remain needed. What would you recommend? I asked quietly. Howard studied me carefully before answering. I would recommend creating boundaries immediately. Legally and financially. The words settled heavily inside me because boundaries sounded simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Especially for mothers. Especially for women raised believing sacrifice proved love. Howard pulled another document from the folder. One option would be creating an educational trust specifically for Sophie someday, while limiting direct access to larger assets. Sophie. The moment he said her name, something inside me softened immediately. Because unlike the adults around her, Sophie still showed concern without calculation attached to it. She called to check on me. She apologized for things she did not cause. She still looked embarrassed when her parents spoke about money in front of me. I would like that, I admitted quietly. Howard smiled faintly. Richard suggested something similar years ago. Of course he did. My husband saw things clearly even when I refused to. We spent another hour reviewing paperwork and discussing options while winter sunlight slowly faded outside the office windows. By the time I finally stood to leave, my emotions felt tangled together in ways I could barely explain. Grief, relief, shame, clarity. Howard walked me toward the lobby himself before speaking one final sentence quietly near the elevators. Evelyn, he said gently, protecting yourself does not mean you stopped loving your son. I nodded slowly even though tears suddenly burned behind my eyes. Because deep down, I think that was exactly what I had feared all along. Not losing money. Losing the illusion that love alone could fix people who no longer valued sacrifice because they had grown too accustomed to receiving it. Outside, snowflakes drifted softly across the courthouse steps while the city lights flickered on one by one against the darkening sky. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and walked carefully toward my car. Then halfway across the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. Daniel. I stared at his name glowing on the screen while cold wind swept around me. For the first time in years, I did not answer immediately. Snow crunched softly beneath my shoes as I crossed the parking lot outside Howard's office building, my phone still vibrating in my coat pocket. Daniel's name glowed across the screen for several seconds before the call finally stopped. Then another call came immediately after. I stared at it while cold wind pushed loose snowflakes across the sidewalk around me. Years ago, seeing my son call would have filled me with warmth. Excitement even. Back when conversations were about baseball games and birthdays and funny stories from Sophie's childhood. Before every phone call slowly transformed into stress wrapped in family language. This time, I let it ring until silence returned again. The drive home felt strangely peaceful despite the storm building overhead. Gray clouds covered the entire sky, and the roads glistened with freezing slush beneath the headlights of passing cars. Christmas lights had started appearing on houses across town now. White lights. Colored lights. Inflatable snowmen wobbling in frozen front yards. Everything looked cheerful from a distance. But I knew better than most people that appearances rarely told the full story about families. Some homes looked warm from the outside while quietly collapsing behind closed doors. Mine included. When I finally pulled into my driveway, it was already dark outside. The porch light illuminated fresh snow collecting along the steps, and for a moment I simply sat there listening to the engine idle softly. Howard's words still echoed through my mind. Protecting yourself does not mean you stopped loving your son. I wanted desperately to believe that. But motherhood changes the way guilt attaches itself to your heart. Even when your children become adults, some part of you still feels responsible for their pain. I carried my purse inside and hung my coat carefully beside the front door. The house greeted me with familiar silence. Usually that silence felt lonely after Richard died. Tonight it felt honest. No manipulation hiding inside it. No expectations. Just quiet. I made myself tomato soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich because cooking elaborate dinners for one person started feeling pointless years ago. While the soup warmed on the stove, I noticed my phone lighting up again on the counter. 3 missed calls from Daniel now. 1 voicemail. Then a text message appeared. Mom, we need to talk. Not, how are you? Not, I am sorry. Just urgency. Need. I finished my dinner slowly at the kitchen table while snow tapped against the windows. Richard used to sit across from me every evening reading the newspaper while I cleaned dishes. Sometimes we barely spoke for 20 minutes at a time, yet the silence always felt comforting instead of empty. There is a certain peace that comes from being loved without performance attached to it. I did not understand how rare that kind of love was until after it disappeared. Around 8 o'clock, the phone rang again. This time I answered. Hello. Daniel spoke immediately, his voice tighter than usual. Why are you ignoring me? No greeting. No concern. Straight into accusation. I was driving, I answered calmly. I left a voicemail. I know. Silence stretched briefly between us. Then Daniel lowered his voice. Mom, this situation is getting serious. I leaned back in my chair and stared toward the dark living room beyond the kitchen doorway. I gathered that. He exhaled heavily into the phone. The bank is threatening legal action if we cannot catch up soon. There was panic underneath his words now. Real panic. And for the first time since this entire situation started, I realized something important. Daniel was afraid. Not embarrassed. Not stressed. Afraid. How much debt are you carrying besides the mortgage? I asked quietly. The silence that followed lasted too long. My stomach tightened immediately. Daniel. Another pause. Then he answered in a low voice. About $80,000. I closed my eyes slowly. $80,000 beyond 6 missed mortgage payments. My chest felt suddenly hollow. How? The word slipped out before I could stop it. Credit cards. The kitchen remodel. Medical bills. Some investment losses. Investment losses. Melissa's boutique business again, I assumed. Probably the luxury SUV too. Maybe vacations they could not afford but took anyway because appearances mattered more than stability. Why did you not tell me sooner? I whispered. Daniel sounded defensive immediately. Because every time we tried to get ahead, something else happened. There it was again. Life happening to them. Never their choices. Never accountability. Just endless bad luck requiring rescue. Mom, he continued quickly, if you help us get through this, I swear things will change. I almost laughed hearing that because I had heard versions of that sentence for nearly 10 years now. Just this once. We will pay you back. Things will stabilize soon. Every promise disappeared the moment the crisis passed. $30,000 will not fix $80,000 of debt, I said softly. Daniel's frustration exploded immediately. So what? You are just going to let us lose the house? I pressed my fingertips gently against my temple because a headache had started building behind my eyes. No, Daniel. I am trying to understand how things got this bad. Things got expensive, he snapped. You have no idea what it costs to survive right now. I stared down at the stack of bills beside my elbow. Property taxes. Heating costs. Prescription expenses. Grocery receipts folded carefully beneath my reading glasses. I understand more than you think, I answered quietly. He became silent for several seconds before speaking again. This time his voice sounded softer. Calculated softer. Mom, Sophie is terrified. There it was. The emotional pressure point. I knew it would come eventually. Daniel understood exactly how much I loved that girl. She should not have to worry about losing her home before Christmas. My throat tightened immediately because despite everything, the thought of Sophie suffering still broke my heart. Daniel heard my silence and pushed further. You have the ability to fix this. Ability. Another word that no longer sounded loving coming from my son. Only transactional. Do you remember when Dad lost his job after the factory downsized? I asked suddenly. Daniel sounded confused by the question. What? You were 13. Silence. Your father worked construction during the day and delivered auto parts at night for almost a year. I cleaned offices after bookkeeping shifts because we could not keep up with bills otherwise. I looked around the small kitchen, Richard, and I fought so hard to keep. Nothing fancy. Nothing luxurious. But ours. Do you know what we did not do during that time? Daniel sighed impatiently. Mom, this is different. We did not buy things we could not afford. My voice stayed calm even though my chest ached. We did not refinance ourselves into debt chasing a lifestyle beyond our means. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. There it is. Judgment. No, I answered quietly. Reality. The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut skin. Finally, Daniel spoke again, colder now. Melissa was right about you. I felt my stomach drop slightly. What does that mean? You care more about money than family. For a moment, I genuinely could not speak. Because hearing my own son say that after decades of sacrifice felt almost unreal. I thought about skipped vacations, double shifts, college tuition payments, emergency loans, birthday checks, Christmas gifts, thousands upon thousands of dollars quietly handed over throughout the years because I loved him more than my own comfort. Yet, somehow the moment I stopped giving, my love itself became questionable. That is not fair, I whispered. Neither is watching my family drown while you sit on savings. Savings. He said the word like it was selfish instead of survival. Like retirement money magically existed without decades of labor behind it. Daniel, I said carefully, what happens after 30,000? What happens 6 months from now? He did not answer. Because we both knew the truth. There would always be another crisis if nothing fundamentally changed. Another payment. Another emergency. Another reason why I should sacrifice my own security to preserve theirs. I cannot keep saving you from choices you refuse to change, I said softly. His breathing grew heavier through the phone. Angry now. Fine. The word came out sharp and wounded. Just remember this conversation when Sophie asks why she lost her home. Then the line disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly onto the kitchen table and sat motionless while snowstorm winds rattled softly against the windows. For several seconds, guilt crashed through me so hard I almost picked the phone back up immediately. But then another thought arrived quietly behind it. Daniel was not trying to solve his problems anymore. He was trying to transfer them. And for the first time in my life, I was beginning to understand the difference. The first foreclosure notice arrived 5 days later. I found it folded inside my mailbox on a bitterly cold Friday afternoon while returning from the grocery store. At first I assumed it belonged to another house on the street because the envelope looked too official, too harsh somehow. But the moment I saw Daniel's address printed beneath the bank logo, my stomach dropped hard enough to make me grip the mailbox for balance. Final notice of intent. Even the wording felt cold. Clinical. Like a machine politely informing someone their life was about to collapse. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I carried the envelope inside along with 2 grocery bags and a gallon of milk. The house felt colder than usual despite the heater running steadily. I placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and stood staring at the unopened notice in my hands for nearly a full minute before finally sitting down at the table. My fingers trembled slightly while opening it. Numbers. Deadlines. Legal language. The amount overdue looked worse than Daniel admitted. Much worse. Nearly $42,000 required immediately to stop proceedings. $42,000. I leaned back slowly in my chair while afternoon sunlight faded gray against the kitchen windows. My son had not simply fallen behind. He was buried. And somehow, deep down, he still believed I was the shovel that would dig him out again. My chest tightened painfully because despite everything, part of me still wanted to save him. That instinct never fully leaves mothers. Even when your children hurt you, even when they manipulate you, love does not disappear cleanly. It lingers like smoke long after the fire should have gone out. I stared across the kitchen toward Richard's old coffee mug sitting near the sink. White ceramic with tiny chips along the handle from years of use. He used that mug every morning for nearly 2 decades. Suddenly, I remembered one particular night from years earlier after Daniel wrecked his first car at 19. Nothing serious. No injuries. But the repairs cost more money than he had. I immediately offered to cover everything because he was young and scared and still my little boy in my eyes. But Richard refused. He needs to pay part of it himself, he said firmly afterward while we stood in this same kitchen arguing quietly so Daniel would not hear us. Otherwise, he learns nothing. I accused Richard of being too hard on him back then. Too stubborn. Looking back now, I think Richard understood something I never wanted to face. Shielding people from consequences too often eventually teaches them they deserve protection from reality itself. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table, pulling me from the memory. Melissa. I stared at the screen before answering carefully. Hello. Her voice sounded unusually emotional immediately. Softer than normal. Evelyn, I think we need to stop fighting. Fighting. As though boundaries were mutual aggression instead of self-preservation. I was not aware we were fighting, I answered quietly. She sighed dramatically. Daniel is falling apart right now. I looked down at the foreclosure notice spread open across the table. I received the letter. Silence filled the line instantly. Then Melissa spoke again, lower this time. Then you know how serious this is. Serious. Another understatement. I rubbed my forehead slowly while exhaustion settled into my bones. Why did you not tell me things were this bad? We were embarrassed. The answer came too quickly. Rehearsed. And, honestly, we thought we could fix it before anyone found out. But they never planned to fix it themselves. Not really. They planned for me to eventually step in once the pressure became unbearable enough. Melissa, I asked quietly, did you really think I could afford $42,000? She hesitated just long enough for the truth to reveal itself. You inherited Richard's retirement accounts. There it was. Not concern for me. Inventory. She knew exactly what assets I still had. The realization sent a cold wave through my chest. That money is supposed to support me for the rest of my life, I whispered. Her voice sharpened immediately. So your comfort matters more than your son losing his home? I closed my eyes because guilt hit exactly where she intended. But this time something else rose alongside it. Clarity. This is not about comfort, I answered carefully. It is about survival. Melissa laughed bitterly under her breath. You own your home outright. You have savings. You have stability. Meanwhile, your granddaughter might wake up homeless after Christmas. Homeless. The word hit hard enough to leave me breathless for a second. Because no matter how manipulative Melissa sounded, Sophie was still innocent in all this. Do not use Sophie to pressure me, I said quietly. Melissa became defensive immediately. I am telling you reality. No, I replied softly. You are trying to make me responsible for reality. Silence followed. Thick and uncomfortable. Then Melissa lowered her voice again. You know what I think? I already knew I would not like the answer. I think you resent us for having the life you never had. I stared at the foreclosure paperwork spread across the kitchen table, while snow drifted softly outside. Luxury vacations. Imported countertops. Designer handbags. Endless upgrades. If this was the life they fought so desperately to preserve, I honestly did not understand it anymore. Melissa, I asked carefully, how much did the kitchen renovation cost? She sounded startled by the question. What? The remodel. Roughly how much? Another pause. Around $60,000. $60,000. I felt something inside me go completely numb then. Because that kitchen alone cost more than Richard and I spent renovating our entire house over 30 years. And the SUV lease? Silence again. Why does that matter? Because every answer painted the truth more clearly. This was never about bad luck. It was about choices. Endless expensive choices supported by the assumption someone else would absorb the consequences eventually. You spent money you did not have, I said quietly. Melissa snapped immediately. Everybody has debt. Not everybody expects a retired widow to erase it for them. The silence afterwards stretched long and ugly. Then, for the first time since this started, Melissa dropped the sweet performance entirely. You know what your problem is? She said coldly. You like feeling needed. The words landed so precisely they almost stole my breath. Because part of me feared she was right. After Richard died, helping Daniel gave structure to my grief. Purpose. Every check I wrote made me feel connected to my family. Important. Less alone. Somewhere along the way, being needed became the closest thing to being loved. Maybe, I admitted softly. But being needed should not cost me my future. She exhaled sharply through the phone. I cannot believe you are doing this. Neither could I. Not completely. Because some part of me still expected to cave eventually. To transfer the money. To rescue everyone again so life could return to normal. But another part of me had started recognizing something terrifying. Normal was destroying me quietly. My savings shrinking. My stress growing. My health worsening. All while Daniel and Melissa kept spending money they did not actually earn. I need time to think, I said carefully. Melissa laughed bitterly. We do not have time. Then the line disconnected abruptly. I lowered the phone slowly and sat motionless in the kitchen while evening darkness settled across the house around me. The foreclosure notice remained open on the table beside Richard's old coffee mug. One represented everything my husband spent his life trying to build. Stability, security, responsibility. The other represented what happened when people confused appearance with success long enough to bury themselves beneath debt. My eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to our bedroom, and suddenly I could almost hear Richard's voice again. Calm. Practical. Tired. You cannot save people from choices they keep making on purpose. Back then I hated hearing him say things like that. Now those words felt less cruel than honest. I folded the foreclosure notice carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I carried it into the living room and set it beside Howard Bennett's business card on the coffee table. 2 pieces of paper. One warning me what my son was losing. The other reminding me what I still had time to protect.